Good morning to all of you. We continue our set of lectures on literary criticism, and today we have feminist criticism. For the beginning, just as usual, please check a short list of questions on the previous lecture to check yourself whether you remember everything or not. And if you don't, please go back to lecture 3 on post-structuralism and deconstruction, and we move on with feminist criticism. I decided not to give you the plan of this lecture because you can always check the time codes under the video, and thus it will be easier for you to navigate through it. So, okay, feminist criticism. And the first thing we have to remember about it is that feminist criticism is not actually what feminism is. It grows from feminism, but they are not the same things. And according to Merriam-Webster dictionary, feminism is the theory of political, economical, and social equality of the sexes, which includes organized activity on behalf of women and on behalf of women's rights and interests. So feminism is not just about the rights of women. It's more about the equality of both sexes. It is about bringing both sexes to equal level of, in terms of political power, economic power, and social equality. Feminism as a social movement originated in the 18th century. And when the Declaration of Independence states that all men were created equal, having equal rights for life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, it literally means man, which means males, because women do not fall under this category of creatures created being equal. And neither do slaves, by the way, because that's a well-known fact that Thomas Jefferson, he owned slaves. So, okay, scholars divide 3 waves of feminism, and the first one starts roughly in the 18th century and lasts until 1920. When women in the US were finally given the right to vote. Well, think about it just for a while. This is the third half of the 20th century, and until that time, women in the US, they didn't have the right to vote. The second wave of feminism starts roughly in 1960s and lasts until 1990s, and it deals with reproductive issues such as birth control, access to birth control. And many of these issues, including abortions and birth control rights, are still being discussed today. And the second issue, which was discussed during this wave of feminism, was a woman's right to enter the workplace and receive equal pay. During the Second World War, lots of men were forced to leave their workplace to go fight for their states. And so when they came back, and women were forced to occupy their working places, working positions. And so when men came back, women were reluctant to give their working places back to men and return home to perform the role of a housewife. So that's where it grows from. And finally, the third wave of feminism, it begins in 1990s as a response to the second wave of feminism. This way is still concerned with social issues, but it stresses a woman's right to choose a more traditional role, for example, the role of a housewife again. And this also when feminism expands to include issues of equality of not only both sexes, but for all oppressed groups, which are gay and transgender rights, elimination of racism. That's why today we are more inclined to speak about gender criticism and not just feminist criticism. Sure, the feminist movement had its literary background and its literary product. And these are just some of the books that make up feminist literary tradition. Mary Wollstonecraft, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, which was written in 1792. Olive Schreiner, Women and Labor, 1911. Virginia Woolf, that's the blue one, A Room of One's Own, which was published in 1929, it very vividly portrays the unequal treatment of women searching for education and other alternatives to motherhood and marriage. The next one is Simone de Beauvoir, The Second Sex, a very important work published in 1949. It has a very important section on portrayal of women in the novels of Lawrence. Male also had their contribution to this tradition, and so male contributions to this tradition of feminist writing as John Stuart Mill's The Subjection of Woman, published in 1869, and finally Friedrich Engels, The Origins of Family, 1884. The feminist literary criticism today is the direct product of women's movement in the 1960s. And this movement was in important ways literary from the very start, because it recognized the importance of women characters portrayed by mostly men in world literature. And it saw it as vital to combat them and to question their authority and their coherence. It simply to which extent those images really corresponded to what women really were or to what women really are. And so they stated that these images of women created by literature were very important because they created the role models for both men and women to state what feminine should really be. And there is a crucial set of distinction in feminist criticism, which is between the feminist, female, and feminine. So Toril Moy explains that the first is a political position. The second is more a matter of biology, and the third is a set of culturally defined characteristics. And this is precisely the distinction between the second and the third, that is, between the female and feminine, where all feminist movement grows from, or all feminist criticism grows from. They try to show you that this is a culturally built, culturally defined issue, this correlation between female and feminine, and so on. So first, feminist critics, they pointed out, for example, that in the 19th century fiction, very few women characters were working to earn a living. Instead, the focus of interest was more shifted to heroine's choice of marriage partner, which will ultimately decide her future happiness, define her social position, exclusively determine her fulfillment in life, or lack of these things. Thus, in feminist criticism of the 70s, the major effort went into exposing the mechanisms of patriarchy, that is, the cultural mindset in men and women which continued this sexual inequality. And critical attention was given to mostly male books and male writers in which influential or typical images of women were constructed. And necessarily the criticism which undertook this position was very combative and polemical. Since that, feminist criticism has changed a lot. And these changes started to happen roughly in 1980s. Firstly, feminist criticism became more eclectic, meaning that it began to draw upon the findings and approaches of other critical schools, such as Marxism or psychoanalytic school or structuralist and linguistic schools, and so on and so on. Secondly, it switched its attention from attacking the male versions of the world to exploring the nature of the female world and outlook, and reconstructing the lost or suppressed records of female experience. And thirdly, the attention was switched to the need to reconstruct a new canon of world literature rewriting the history of world literature that will include all the neglected women writers, or all the suppressed women writers that were not included in this canon before. Elaine Showalter, who you can now see on the screen, she, for instance, describes that in 1970s, there was a shift of attention from andro texts, which are books written by men, to genotexts. And these are books written by women. And she coined the term genocritics, which means the study of genotexts. And the subject of genocritics, as she says, is the history, styles, themes, genres, structures of writings by women, the psychodynamics of female creativity, or the trajectory of female character, the evolution of or laws of female literary tradition, and so on and so on. And Showalter defines 3 phases of women writing, and these are a feminine phase, a feminist phase, and a female phase. The first one roughly starts from 1840s and lasts until 1880s. And this is the time when women writers imitated dominant male traditions and norms of performing literature, norms and aesthetic standards. The second phase, which she calls a feminist phase, lasts from 1880. Again, this is a very rough distinction, but approximately from 1880 to 1920. It is characterized with radical and separatist positions, which were maintained by women writers. That means that women in literature were seeking for their own ways of expression, their own feminine language. Is it really that men and women think differently so that they have different means of expressing themselves, defined biologically, and so on and so on? This is what the second phase was mostly about. And finally, the female phase starts in 1920 and lasts, it is still in progress. And it looks particularly at female writing and female experience in these writings. The reasons for this liking for phasing, they are very complex, but partly this is the result of the view that feminist criticism required a terminology to attain some kind of theoretical responsibility. Secondly, and probably which is more important, is that in all intellectual discipline, there is a great need to establish a sense of progress. But feminist criticism since 1970s has been remarkable for the wide range of positions which existed within it. So the movement itself, it's very eclectic and diverse. But mostly the debates, they have been centered on 3 particular issues. And these issues are the role of theory in feminist criticism, that is how much we have to which extent feminist criticism has to base their work on some theoretical work, such as Marxist theory or structuralist theory or again psychoanalytic theory and so on and so on, linguistic theory, by the way. The second issue is the nature of language. Again, is there any specific women writing, a specific women language defined biologically, because men and women think differently and perceive the world differently? And the third one is the value or otherwise of psychoanalysis. So an important thing that we have to keep in mind when speaking about feminist criticism is that there are actually 2 main branches in critical theory, 2 main schools within the feminist literary tradition. And these are Anglo-American version of feminism and French feminists. This is a very rough distinction because not all the so-called Anglo-American feminist critics are from the US or from Britain, and neither are all French feminists from France. But this is what we have. There exists such distinction. A major division between these two critical schools within the feminist tradition is their attitude to the amount of theory which is necessary to use in their works. And generally, Anglo-American version of feminism has been more skeptical and more cautious about using theory in their works, while French feminists have adopted a great deal of theoretical thinking, such as, for example, Marxist theory and post-structuralist theory, psychoanalytic theory. They would usually base their work mainly on critical theories, some post-structuralist or psychoanalytic, for example. The Anglo-Americans maintain a major interest in traditional critical concepts like theme, motive, characterization, and they would treat literature from realistic positions as a series of representations of women's lives and experience, which can be measured and evaluated against reality. And they would mostly practice close reading, and generally their criticism reminds to a great deal a liberal humanism tradition. And in contrast to the Americans, the works of French feminists is overly more theoretical. They have taken a lot from Lacan, Foucault, and Derrida's thinking. For these literal theorists, a literary text is never primarily a representation of reality or a reproduction of personal goals. French theorists would often deal with concerns other than literature. For example, they would write about language, representation, psychology, and so on and so on. The major figures within the French literary feminist tradition are Julia Kristeva, who's actually Bulgarian, Elaine Showalter, who is Algerian born, and Lucie Rigori. These are the main names. Another fundamental issue in which opinions are just polarized is the question of whether or not there exists a specific kind of language which is inherently feminine. And there is a long-standing tradition concerning this issue. For example, Virginia Woolf, in her essay, A Room of One's Own, states that, or rather suggests that language is gendered. And so when women writers turn to a novel writing, for example, they find out that there is no common sentence ready for their use. And Woolf states that there is a correlation between sex and language usage. She doesn't fully explain what kind of correlation that is, but she would rather take a sentence, cite it, and they then say, this is a male sentence. It doesn't suit for woman usage. She actually doesn't analyze the peculiarities of this sentence, but nevertheless, it is seen that the sentence, which she calls a male sentence, is very rationally and logically structured. It doesn't suit women, she says. So when women writers who tried to use it in the 19th century, for example, they didn't succeed in doing that. Instead, says Woolf, when Jane Austen comes into the literary scene, she would experiment with the language usage and find a way of expressing herself which is specifically feminine. She would find a specific feminine language suitable precisely for women. And French theorists, therefore, have posited the existence of an écriture féminin, or women writing. This is the term introduced by French theorist Elaine Showalter from her essay, The Love of Medusa. And this écriture féminin is, according to Showalter, associated with feminine and facilitating and with a free play of meanings within the framework of laws and grammatical structures, and so on and so on. And if we look at Cixous's own writing in that very essay, The Laugh of Medusa, her heightened prose of the heightened prose of her essay would both demonstrate and explain it greatly, because she says, there is a quotation on the screen, "It is impossible to define a feminine practice of writing, and this is an impossibility which will remain, for this practice can never be theorized, enclosed, coded dots. It will always surpass the discourse that relates the phallocentric or male-dominated system, which is not yet the end of the sentence. It does and will take place in areas other than those subordinated to philosophical, theoretical domination," and so on and so on. And if we look at this sentence, we will see that the grammatical structure of this sentence is very loose, and she would tend to use dots and ellipses and gaps and omissions, and the logical sequence of her thought is not that straightforward. So once again, introduced by Elaine Showalter in her essay, The Laugh of Medusa, Erciture féminin, or women writing, refers to a uniquely feminine style of writing, which is characterized by disruptions, ellipses, puns, omissions, gaps, silences, new images, and so on and so on. And let us now look at several examples from the world literature so that we could better understand what is feminine writing and what is male writing. That's an important thing to keep in mind, that feminine writing is not necessarily used by women only. This is not a question of gender. This is rather a style of writing. And that's why it actually can be used by both male and female. And the first example I would like to introduce to you is taken from Samuel Beckett's Not I. You can see the beginning of this play on the screen. It's quite obvious that he would use lots of omissions, ellipses, dots, very loosened grammatical structure. Out into this world, tiny little thing before its time, in a gut for what girl? Yes, tiny little thing, into this, out into this, before her time, God forsaking whole cold, no matter, parents unknown, and so on and so on. And thus, in this very logical manner, he would actually tell the story of a woman from the moment of her birth up to the moment of her death. And from this point of view, this is obviously an example of the so-called écriture féminin. Despite the fact that Beckett was a man, he would use, in this very example, he would use a feminine way of writing. Another example, which I'd like to share with you, is taken from Jack London's Martin Eden. And here we see a totally different picture, because if you look at the third passage, you would read that he stepped back to the table, tore open the envelope, and began to read, giving the stranger an opportunity to recover himself. The end of the thought. And the stranger understood and appreciated. Another thought has ended. He was the gift of sympathy, understanding, and beneath his alarmed exterior of sympathetic progress went on the end of the third thought. So we see that the structure of the sentence is very logical, is very rational. All the thoughts follow each other in a very logical manner. He is not inclined to use gaps or ellipses or puns. He's not playing with words and so on and so on. The next one is from Jane Austen, from Sense and Sensibility. Chapter 42 would start with actually a huge passage, not that logically structured as we saw that, for example, in Jack London's writing when we discussed Martin Eden just now. She states, one other short call in Harley Street in which Eleanor received her brother's congratulations on their traveling so far towards Barton without any expense, and on Colonel Brandon's being to follow them in Cleveland in a day or two, completed the intercourse of the brother and sister in town. And a faint invitation from Fanny to come to Norland whenever it should happen to be in their way, which of all the things was the most unlikely to occur, with a more warm, though less public assurance from John to Eleanor of the promptitude with which she should come to see her at Delaford, was all that foretold any meeting in the country. The end of the sentence. I would say that this is rather an example of feminine writing. First of all, because Virginia Woolf in her essay, A Room of One's Own, would provide an example of Austen's writing, and she would tend to refer Jane Austen's sentence to a specifically feminine way of writing. And secondly, because this sentence is a rather long sentence containing several different thoughts, not that logically structured as it was in Martin Eden, for example. Okay, the next and probably the last for today example would be from Melville's Moby Dick. And of course, Melville was a man, but the type of the sentence that he would use in his novel, I would rather refer this type of the sentence to a feminine style of writing. I'm going now to explain why I think so. As he mounted to the deck, Ahab abruptly accosted him without at all heeding that he had in his hand, but in his broken lingo. The German soon evidenced his complete ignorance of the white whale, immediately turning the conversation to the lamp feeder and oil can, with some remarks touching his having to turn into his hammock at night in profound darkness, his last drop of Bremen oil being gone, and not a single flying fish yet captured to supply the deficiency, concluding by hinting that his ship was indeed what in the fishery is technically called clean one, that is an empty one, well deserving the name of Jungfrau or the Virgin. And only now we've got the end of the sentence, which starts with the moment of the characters meeting Captain Ahab at the deck of the ship, and then would rather go in circles again and again, returning to the idea of the deficiency, and from time to time given references to this image of the white whale, and then again going back to the idea that they have got nothing yet. And Erciture féminin is then by nature transgressive, rule transcending, and we may also say intoxicated. Okay, further expression of the notion of Erciture féminin is found in the writing of Julia Kristeva. And she uses the terms of symbolic and semiotic to designate the two different aspects of language. In her essay, The System and the Speaking Subject, the symbolic aspect is associated with authority, father, order, repression, control, rules. And by contrast, the semiotic aspect of discourse is characterized not by logic and order, but by displacement, slippage, and by what she calls condensation. And it should be stressed that for her, the symbolic and semiotic are not two different kinds of language, but rather two different aspects of language, both of which would usually be present in any utterance. Just as the aspects of conscious and unconscious would always be present in any saying, in any text, in any utterance again. I think we can illustrate this distinction between symbolic and semiotic aspects of the text, of the cultural text. If we turn, for example, to the Disney movies of the last 2 decades and the representation of female characters in these movies, and we will see that on the surface, which is symbolic aspect of this cultural utterance of this cultural text, or the so-called conscious level, the female characters are becoming increasingly stronger and more independent, and they tend to be more active characters rather than just passive good girls possessing all the set of Christian virtues, waiting for someone to rescue them, or just having hope and trust and believing in something good to happen with them, but doing nothing. We see that in the 21st century, female characters are becoming more independent and more active. This is the symbolic level. But on the other hand, at the subconscious level, or at which Kristeva would probably call a semiotic aspect of this cultural text, we would surprisingly notice that in the overall, female characters, they speak less, for example. Or in the overall, there are much fewer female characters in recent movies than they had, for example, in the mid-20th century. So this is basically how it works, I guess, this distinction between symbolic and semiotic aspects of the language. And finally, the third point of disagreement between Anglo-American and French feminists is the relationship of feminist criticism and psychoanalysis. The very idea that feminist criticism has taken a lot from psychoanalysis, keeping in mind the statement of penis envy introduced by Freud and lots of other statements, it was weird and illogical at first sight. And yet, the history of relationship between feminist criticism and psychoanalysis, it is very long and complicated. And it actually starts with Kate Smillet's Sexual Politics in 1969, which condemns Freud as a prime source of patriarchal attitudes in the society against which feminists must fight. And this idea is still very influential among feminist critics and is still very strong. But Freud was defended in a series of important works. For example, in Juliet Mitchell's Psychoanalysis and Feminism, issued in 1974. What does she do? I mean, Mitchell, how does she defend him? Generally, her ideas boil down to the statement that Freud's idea of penis envy shouldn't be understood that literally, and it is more about social position and power which this organ symbolizes in Western society, and that's how it works. And from this perspective, everything works perfectly together. Okay, how feminist critics would use a psychoanalytic approach in their work? For example, they would notice that the situation of gender inequality is sustained by culture. Well, just to give you some examples, they would notice that most traditional religions such as Catholicism, Protestantism, Islam, Orthodox Judaism assign women to secondary roles, okay, or some of them even forbid women from practicing in public activities with men, as they have it in some Eastern religions. Or they would notice that in mythology, women are often associated with danger, uncontrolled bodily urges, madness, while men are usually linked to reason, courage, and independence. Well, some positive traits, some positive things. Or they would notice that even in modern Western culture, modern Western cultural forms such as film, because the industry is largely owned and controlled by men, these forms would foster assumptions that further subordination of women. For example, images of strong, publicly competent, clever women are still hard to come by in film culture, while images of women who are evil because they possess too much, because they possess too much power, are fairly easy to find. And so psychoanalytic approach would not only notice all these things like 1, 2, 3, 4, not only notice all these signs of inequality, but they will try to explain them through the psychoanalytic lens with the help of psychoanalytic approach. For example, trying to explain why in traditional societies women are often made to appear under total control of their husbands. French feminist and philosopher Lucie Irigaray, this is her picture on the screen, argues that images of frighteningly powerful, castrating, as she says, women appear so frequently in male-dominated culture because man's first relationship in the world was with his mother. And that mother is an overpowering figure being associated with the threat of engulfment. Thus, man would compensate for this initial state of powerlessness by engaging in an extreme rejection of the mother and of all that represents mother figure in terms of care and empathy. And for man to have an identity and to have power, the mother must be subordinated, and anything associated with her has to be depicted as evil. And that symbolic early objects in one's life get transferred, of course, into women in general. And this would explain, for example, why in traditional societies women would usually be subordinated to men from the point of view of Irigaray. American feminist scholars Sandra Gilbert and Susan Goubard, they add an important detail to this argument in their essay, The Mad Woman in the Attic. They notice that in male literary tradition, women would usually be portrayed either as angels or as evils. And they're trying to think why it happens like that. And Irigaray's account of how men compensate for the mother's early power over them helps account for the angel ideal. Gilbert and Goubard say that men learn to abstract from material life because material life is associated with the early experiences of union with mother's body. And in pushing matter and everything material away, matter would be replaced by the spirit of ideality, a realm of pure mental abstractions that, well, assure men of their ability to control the physical world. And the angel ideal, which appears in literature or in movies, converts physical women into spiritual beings. But in so doing, it essentially kills them, they state. And thus, woman is still suppressed to the male figure. So what would feminist critics usually do with the text? First of all, they would try to rethink the canon, aiming at the rediscovery of the texts written by women. They would revalue women's experience and examine representations of women in literature by men and women. They would also challenge representations of women as other or leg or second sex or a part of nature, like secondary creatures and so on and so forth. They would examine power relations which obtain in text and in life with a view to break them down. And they would see reading as a political act and showing the extent of patriarchy. They would also raise a question of whether men and women are essentially different because of biology, or is this difference socially constructed? They would explore the question of whether there is a female language, or a so-called écriture féminin, biologically predetermined, and whether this is also available to men, I mean, this écriture féminin. They would reread psychoanalysis to further explore the issues of female and male identity. And these are some of the questions that you may probably ask if you want to look at the text from the feminist position, through the feminist lens. You may ask, for example, is the author male or female? Is the text narrated by a male or female? What types of roles do women play in the text? Are there female characters the protagonists, or do they play secondary or minor roles? Do any stereotypical characterizations of women appear in this text? What are the attitudes towards men held by male characters? What is the author's attitude towards women in the society as it appears in the text? How does the author's culture influence his or her attitude? Do the female and male characters speak differently in the text? To illustrate the feminist critic approach to a literary or a cultural text, let us probably take a cartoon by Disney Studio from 1989, which is The Little Mermaid. And for the beginning, we see that there is a clear and very obvious distinction of all female characters into either angels or evils, just as it was stated in Gilbert and Goupart essay. And thus we may develop further this idea of dematerializing of female characters by male writers and thus metaphorically killing them. But this is just to start with. Because on the other hand, this fairy tale and this cartoon is feminist in many aspects. First of all, Ariel is initially supposed to be the embodiment of femininity as expected by the society. She has to embrace simplicity, humility, and beauty, but nevertheless, she violates the ban. And she does that because she is still in search of her own identity. The thing which we didn't see in Cinderella or in Sleeping Beauty or in Snow White, the cartoons before that. So she's still in search of her own identity, and she doesn't feel completely satisfied and happy at home having what she has. She is looking for something more. If we look at this fairy tale and cartoon from the formalist point of view, the tale falls under one of the fabulous structures described by Propp. Well, he says that a family member leaves home, there is a prohibition which the protagonist cannot violate. The protagonist violates the ban. After that, the antagonist tries to learn more about the hero. The antagonist is given information about the victim, tries to deceive their victim in order to get benefit from it. The victim succumbs to deception and thus unwillingly helps the enemy. The antagonist harms or plans to harm one of the family members, etc., etc. If you look once again into this list of fabular structural elements described by Propp, you would see that all of them are present in Disney cartoon after Andersen's fairy tale. But all those, despite this idea that all those stages can be seen in The Little Mermaid as well, the story already contains a feminist perspective, because the very reason for violating the ban by a female protagonist is her unwillingness to accept the social role offered to her, and is her search of her own identity. Then the fairy tale contains a very vivid and interesting motive of a woman losing her voice. Instead, she gets all the beauty standards necessary to achieve success for women in the society she lives, or in the society she wants to live. So we've got a clear message. Social success implies beauty and humility, but doesn't imply having your own voice. What happens then? This scheme doesn't work. So we've got message number 2. A woman has to have her own voice in modern society. But the Disney cartoon, because the original fairy tale, it has a different ending. So the Disney cartoons, it sets a problem, but doesn't actually solve it. Because in the end, it's Ariel's father who presents her the right to have both voice, which is the right to be heard, and the right to be called and considered a woman, because this is he who gives her legs so that she can feed all the Western beauty standards. So again, this paradigm of man's power, it is still kept. The mechanisms of patriarchy are saved here. I also found a very interesting article in Washington Post from the 25th of January 2016, which provides a feminist approach to Disney cartoons, and particularly to Disney princesses' evolution. The scholars state that at first glance, it may seem that the female characters are becoming increasingly more independent throughout the Disney history. And if we compare Aurora from the Sleeping Beauty to, say, Moana or Merida from the Brie, the difference between those characters will seem obvious for us. And thus, we may conclude that feminism really works. But if we look, for example, at the amount of words spoken by both men and women, we would see that in the classic 3 Disney princesses films, which are Snow White, Cinderella, and Sleeping Beauty, men and women, male and female characters speak like 50-50, approximately the same amount of words. But by contrast, all the princess movies from 89 to 99, which is called the Disney's Renaissance era, they are startlingly male-dominated. Men speak like 68% of words in The Little Mermaid, 71% of time in The Beauty and the Beast, 90% of time in Aladdin, and so on and so on. You may pause the video and have a look at the data, which actually states that in recent movies by the Disney studio, women, instead of looking on the surface more independent, speak fewer words, fewer amount of words. Just as well, part of the problem is that these newer films, they are mostly populated by men. Aside from the heroine, these films, they often offer few examples of women being powerful or respected or useful or even comedic. So this is basically everything that I wanted to share today with you. And thanks for watching this lecture. I hope we will go back to its key points during our next meeting with you. If you have some free time during this week, please think about some well-known texts, either literary or cinematographic, and try to apply the feminist approach to these texts. We will discuss your findings during our next class, and I hope you will get some fun, and see you in a week.